Hello. Thank you, Ellen, for the introduction and the wonderful presentation setting up our discussion today. I'm very excited to be moderating our first panel. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, but leave the details of their biographies to the printed agendas in front of you so you can, so we can save more time for conversation. I'm joined by Dave Puglia from Western Growers, Cindy Tuck from the Association of California Water Agencies, and Laurel Firestone from the Community Water Center. And our goal for the next hour is to talk about legislative priorities for California's cities, farms, and rural communities. So we have a representative from each one of those categories up here for our conversation. This past year was a very eventful one already in the California legislature relating to water management. It's the first of a 2-year legislative cycle, and Governor Brown already passed around a dozen bills impacting the way we manage water. I'm looking forward to our conversation and hoping we can cover what was passed, what's still pending, and what future issues we might want to tackle in the near future. So just as a summary for the audience, the bills that were signed this year already cover a wide range of issues, from funding water infrastructure to reporting on new groundwater wells. We have a bill that, if is held up in the courts, may make it easier to raise money for stormwater management. 2 bills that expanded funding options for drinking water quality and emergency water supply needs. There's new legislation on standards for water use measurement and reporting, and further direction to the State Board on direct potable reuse. And finally, in June 2018, we have a new water bond heading to California voters, $4 billion for parks, open space, and water management. But I want to start with a topic that didn't make it all the way to the governor's desk this year, but is likely to stay on everyone's radar, and that's a new source of funding for safe drinking water in California's disadvantaged communities. As Ellen highlighted, there are hundreds of small communities in California who are not able to provide safe drinking water. It's a problem that's been on the radar, and while significant strides have been made, the main challenge still remains to provide a durable funding source for these communities to maintain safe systems. So SB 623 was introduced this year, and it would create a safe and affordable drinking water fund funded through 2 sources: fees on agricultural chemicals and urban water use. And so I'm going to start with Laurel on this topic. Your work with the Community Water Center has put you at the forefront of this challenge, and I know you've supported the passage of SB 623. So I wanted to start with you and ask you to explain why you think that it's the right framework for addressing this challenge, and how you think in the end it will help these communities.
Great, thank you. So we really see this issue of ensuring all Californians can have access to safe, clean, affordable drinking water as a defining moment for our state. Who are we as a state? And in 2012, we passed the Human Right to Water, and we said that as a state, it's our policy that every human being should be able to access safe, clean, affordable drinking water. And since that time, we've been working, step by step, piece by piece, with stakeholders, including the groups represented here and many others, local, state, even international folks, to make the kind of progress we need to make. But for too long, since then, and frankly before then, we haven't been able to have the leadership it takes to make the really hard decision, and that is, how do we actually address this issue of a sustainable funding source? That alone won't solve all of our problems, but it is a threshold issue that we cannot solve this crisis that dwarfs the size of Flint. It dwarfs the size of many of the other drinking water sort of scandals in terms of throughout the country. We have hundreds of systems who, some of which for over a decade, haven't been able to supply safe drinking water in homes and schools. And without fundamentally addressing a stable funding source, which is always, at the top of any recommendation, whether it's at the state or local or policy levels, what that's going to take is a 2/3 vote, and that is tough politically. I mean, we're here in Sacramento, we know that. But it's been too long, and if we don't do that, it's really a matter of life and death for hundreds of thousands of Californians. And I think what SB 623 is really the first time that a full package has come together that will finally address this. We think it's narrowly tailored and effective to ensure that it's going to be able to address all contaminants out there, leverage the other funding sources that are there, and future funding sources that may be there. So be able to leverage bonds, whether it's existing bonds or future bonds, be able to leverage other federal sources, making sure that we're able to cover gaps that aren't included, that aren't allowed to be covered by bonds, which pretty much cover capital funding. So particularly ensuring that we're able to cover operations and maintenance, but also other gaps that come up around planning and technical assistance that are vital for making sure that the communities that need it most are actually going to be able to access those sources. And ensuring that we're using this funding to drive sustainable, cost-effective solutions. So the mechanism that that this bill outlines, and are building in a mechanism to, on an annual basis, do a needs assessment to determine exactly who in California doesn't have access to safe drinking water. That's going to improve over time. We don't have perfect information right now, for example, on many of the private well owners. And as this report mentions, we need even better metrics. But this bill sets a framework where we can make sure that we're developing that and improving that each year. Then we're using that to tailor the implementation plan to fill those gaps and allow the funding to evolve over time, so that while initially there may be more planning and consolidation projects and different things, that over time it may tailor down to focus on O&M alone to be able to sustain expensive treatment in areas with contaminated water with contaminants like arsenic. And then also making sure that we're utilizing the data that exists better, collecting local data on private well contamination so that we can target assistance to those areas and better tailor needs. This will increase accountability and transparency and help us move systems to being able to sustain safe drinking water for everyone. In our state, we've really allowed California to structure drinking water service in this very fractured way. Even though this is a basic human right that we've put into statute, we, unlike other utilities, we have, I think, close to 4,000 community water systems throughout the state. And, we don't even know how many private well owners, basically. And so in other sectors where it's less fragmented, we have been able to build into the cost of service service to underserved areas. So whether it's energy or telecom, but in water, unlike other utilities, we still don't have any mechanism where we are ensuring that users are helping to ensure access in underserved areas. So what this bill does is create a narrowly tailored safe drinking water fee that community water system users would see that is capped at 95 cents as a maximum. It would go down depending on what needs are there. There would be an exemption for low-income residents. And there's actually a number of different agricultural fees that are paying for the nitrate, about 20% nitrate share of the Drinking Water Challenge right now, including a fertilizer fee and dairy producer fee, and they're looking also at establishing other feedlots or animal facilities. So overall, this issue is something that Californians, when you go out and poll Californians, that they care about more deeply than anything else, is really ensuring that everyone, that the water that comes out of their tap is not poisoning their children or their neighbors' children. And the vast majority of Californians, when polled, would like to pay $1 or more, more than $4 in some cases, in a majority of those polled, to ensure that every community has access to safe drinking water. So even if their own community is if they feel like their own community has access to safe drinking water, they would be willing to pay $1 a month to ensure that other communities have access to that same basic right. So this bill helps pull all of that together. I think it's the first time, that we've been able to be working together with strongly with agriculture. We have a number of water districts, private water companies, local jurisdictions, counties, and public health organizations, labor, across the board. There's more than 100 supporters looking to make sure that we get this bill over the finish line and that we finally address this crisis as a state.
Thank you, Laurel. That's a great transition to my question for Cindy, which is that ACWA has been skeptical about using a statewide fee for this particular challenge. So can you tell us why, and more importantly, what you think is the right framework for raising this money?
Yes, and thank you, and good morning to everyone. We think that the current version of SB 623 isn't the right framework. There's a lot that we do agree on. We agree with the intent of the bill, which is to provide the funding streams, the funding solution for disadvantaged communities that don't have safe drinking water. We believe that every Californian deserves to have safe drinking water and should have safe drinking water. So, those are things we agree on. Most Californians do have safe drinking water. For the communities that do not, it is really a social issue for the state of California. And part of the bill we're okay with, and that's what we call the ag solution. And I'm sure Dave will talk about that in some depth, I think. And Laurel talked about some of that. But that part of the bill proposes to have fees on fertilizer sales, fees related to dairies, and that's intended to collect about $30 million per year for a period of time. In our suggested solution, we incorporate that solution. So we're okay with that part. The part of the bill that we're not okay is the $110 million per year part of the bill. Laurel referenced a fee. It is a tax on drinking water. And that's our fundamental concern with the bill. We don't think it makes sense to tax drinking water. In California, we tax cigarettes. That makes sense. Drinking water is essential to life. We don't think that makes sense to tax drinking water. Another concern we have is, as Laurel mentioned, there's increasingly a focus on the affordability of water, and that's a very important discussion. We're part of that discussion in the state water board processes that is happening right now. But we think setting the precedent for a tax on drinking water, that works against affordability. And finally, another major concern, there was reference to thousands of community water systems. We don't think it makes sense to turn thousands of local water systems into tax collectors for the state of California. So those are some of our concerns with the framework that's currently in SB 623. But we do think there can be a solution. We've suggested one. We're open to other ideas. And I'd just like to quickly outline what we think the one solution is. And that would be a package of funds. So the first part of the package should be federal money. And one positive thing that is happening in Washington is they're not proposing to cut drinking water funding. So there's the federal Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund. It's called the state revolving fund, but it's federal money that can be used for capital. Then another part of the package should be bond money. All of our organizations were supportive of Prop 1. That included over $500 million for safe drinking water and clean water prioritized for disadvantaged communities. Now, the State Water Board's been doing a good job of allocating that money, and there's a greater need, and that's why the Pro Tem carried SB 5 this year. The governor signed it. That'll be on the ballot in June. And SB 5 has about over $250 million for safe drinking water and clean water. There's also a bond by Jerry Merrill and the Natural Heritage Institute. It hasn't qualified yet, but we think it will qualify, and that'll be on the November ballot. That proposes $750 million for safe drinking water. So that's all of that, and those two measures, we think they could be complementary. That provides capital for these types of projects. Then a third part of the package would be the ag solution, $30 million per year focused on the nitrate part of the problem. And then finally, what's been the we call it the tough nut to crack, it's the operation and maintenance part of it, because you generally can't use the bond money and you can't use the federal money for this category. So it's the operation and maintenance for the non-nitrate part. We think that should be coming from the general fund. Laurel referenced leadership. And if the leadership in California would step up and make this a high priority for the state, there could be general fund for this category, and we'd have a complete package. And as Ellen said today, this is a solvable problem. So that's the solution. We want to work with the proponents over the interim. We would love to be hand in hand on a solution next year. We want to solve this. But the current version of SB 623 with the tax on drinking water, we will continue to oppose.
Can I ask one follow-up question? In the part of your solution, you talk about the general fund for ongoing maintenance, operation and maintenance. How, in your guys' minds, would you protect that money from other uses within the general fund so it could be used over the long term for some of these communities that might need long-term support? As we've seen, general fund money can get used, moved around, and it's not always protected in the same way.
And that's something we would like to work with the proponents on. But and I think there's a question of how much that number is. For example, State Water Board came out with a number in the last year of $34 million per year for the non-nitrate part. $34 million per year is really budget dust in terms of the general fund. Now, that number in discussions that may be higher than that, but we think if the leadership supports it, it can be funded, and then we don't see a future governor and legislature taking that away for future years.
I'm going to move to Dave and talk about the ag solution part of this. And from your community's perspective, can you describe a little bit more about what's in the bill for that solution and your guys' take on it?
Sure. First, thank you to PPIC, Ellen, for including us in the program. Agriculture doesn't, we think, get enough opportunities to speak to people who aren't part of the industry, so this is a great opportunity. I want to thank you for that. Thanks, Cindy, for agreeing that we should tax ourselves. I appreciate that. That's nice.
Wasn't our idea.
That's very kind of you. So I think it's helpful, why would, despite my facetiousness a minute ago, why would agriculture agree to tax itself? I want to step back a little bit and reset the nitrate discussion, because a lot of this is about nitrate. You recall several years ago, UC Davis issued the report by Dr. Harder that placed the nitrate problem in the San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley as a 93 or 94% responsibility from historic agricultural operations, without distinguishing between dairies and horticultural crops and those kinds of things. You can argue about those numbers, but clearly long-time farming activity in those areas resulted in nitrate moving below the nitrogen moving below the root zone and becoming nitrate. That was then followed by a State Water Board report to the legislature with recommendations of how to tackle the problem. And their solutions went in sort of descending order. And the top of their preferred solutions were the broadest funding mechanisms you can imagine, such as a fee on water users, a fee on food, a tax on food, a tax on fertilizer, and all the way down at the bottom, their least preferred option was enforcement against farmers using the Porter-Cologne Act, the state's water quality control law. So that was maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And since then, the legislature, despite a lot of prodding by some good advocates here and elsewhere, didn't do anything. In the meantime, the State Water Board's Office of Enforcement, 2 years ago now almost, began issuing threatened cleanup and abatement order letters to landowners in the Salinas Valley. That was followed by a batch of similar letters to landowners, we're talking about farmers here, in the Tulare Lake Basin. And the implication of those letters was very serious and very real. You will either meet with us right now and agree to pay for and provide replacement drinking water to the domestic well users and other well users who have nitrate contamination, have maybe had a spike historically over the last 10 years, maybe the water's okay now, doesn't matter. If they've been in exceedance at any period in the last 10 years, you're going to pay for the replacement water without any limitation on time. So that's a gun to the head. And that explains why I'm here, why I'm supporting a tax on fertilizer for my members. Might as well be candid, right? I mean, this isn't all going to be happy talk. So we have worked very, very closely with Laurel and with others to structure this kind of a solution. We think it makes a lot of sense. We're calling it hit on ourselves. The bill would require us in agriculture to pay $30 million per year, roughly, based on fertilizer sales. So that number could go up, could go down. But that creates a reliable, predictable revenue stream to address the nitrate part of this problem. I want to make one other comment about nitrates. There's a distinction to be made here between nitrate and other contaminants. And I don't mean to belittle the seriousness of nitrate contamination in drinking water. It is a serious problem. But remember what I said earlier, nitrate presence in groundwater is the product of agricultural activity. Farmers, since the dawn of agriculture, have applied nitrogen fertilizer to their fields. It's how we grow food. It's how we boost yields. It's how we feed people. Back millennia ago, it was manure. Now we have synthetic fertilizers, but it's all the same stuff. It's nitrogen and phosphorus and some other things. Nitrogen converts to nitrate as it goes below the root zone. So the problem we have in Salinas Valley and the San Joaquin Valley is really a legacy problem that stems from over-application of nitrogen fertilizer for many, many decades. The state's response through the State Water Board has been to treat the farmers today as industrial polluters, as if they and their predecessors deliberately dumped solvents or some other known toxic chemical into the ground. They didn't do that. They were coached by the land-grant universities, by USDA, and by the states for decades on the rate of nitrogen they should apply to different crops in different soil types and different climates. Our knowledge has improved over time, as you would expect. We now know far more about nitrogen application rates, how much we should apply, when we should apply it, what different plants take up in terms of the rate of take-up of nitrogen. And so we're a lot better at it. And far less nitrogen is escaping the root zone. It's, I think, virtually impossible to guarantee that we can ever prevent any molecule of nitrogen from going below the roots of plants, because you get unexpected events in farming. You get a rainstorm and you didn't expect one, you just applied fertilizer, and you're going to wash some of that below the root zone. But we're far better at it today. We apply nitrogen through drip systems, so it goes directly to the roots. We don't have broad application across soils. So the point here is, and I'm maybe whining a little bit, but we come into trying to solve this problem, as I said, with a gun to our head, with the knowledge that the farmers of today are doing things as best as they can, given the science and knowledge we have around fertilizers, far better than previous generations, and the previous generations did things the best they could, given the knowledge of the time. Yet this is equated with an industrial pollutant type of scenario. It's not. And so that's why a solution like this makes so much sense, because we are taking responsibility. We're going to call in a fee on our own fertilizer use to help provide drinking water, safe drinking water to these people who are now drawing on wells with nitrate contamination. But if we're going to do this, let's, as a state, go for the whole solution here. Nitrate's not the only contaminant of concern in California drinking water. There are far more serious contaminants from a toxicity standpoint, including in ag areas, naturally occurring contaminants like arsenic, that we need to address as well. And that calls for a broader solution than just more fees on agriculture.
All right, we could talk about this all this time. I'm going to go back to Laurel just briefly, and then we're going to move on to a new topic.
Thank you. Thanks. I just want to add a couple of things. One is, we refer to this problem as just a rural issue, and I do think it's important that we understand that this actually does affect all areas of California. The commonality here is it often is small systems, this sort of fragmentation, which are, in particular, low-income communities and communities of color that have been excluded from larger urban areas, or where there's been inadequate service, but that includes in urban areas. So I want to make sure that it's clear this is a statewide issue. Also, that the general fund challenge here is when a community goes out to finance a water treatment project for arsenic, or a surface water treatment facility to substitute their source of drinking water. When they go to finance that, they can't say, I can afford the O&M long-term on this because I believe that every legislature for the next 20 or 30 years is going to appropriate $34 million for safe drinking water in the budget. That's not how finance works, and that's not how we can really solve solutions. So I don't see the general fund as being as fundamentally addressing this issue. Also, the general fund has been supporting this and needs to continue to support it, particularly for things like, during the drought, the general fund continuously was putting in money for the emergency costs of us not addressing this problem, which continue to increase and are not the way that our state should be putting money in. And until we actually address this, we're going to continue to see the problem increase. We're going to actually start to see less trust in public water systems because this problem of those without safe drinking water is more visible. And I think that it's also important to just mention there's discuss of this as a water tax or a public goods charge. And I think, this is kind of a wonky Sacramento crowd. So I think I want to clarify the difference here for those, that aren't clear on this. A water tax would be a tax on all uses of water. This is actually very narrowly tailored towards users of community water systems on their drinking water bill. So it's and those are the folks that have said, we care about this. We want to make sure that all communities can have what we have. And then secondly, this is not trying to address all public goods of that we get from and that we need to address that goes with water. So it's not ecosystems. It's not so many of the other things that we'll talk about today that also need funding sources. This is saying, let's look at this particular need, tailor it directly to how we're delivering safe water in the state, and make sure that we're finally solving this. Thanks.
Okay, Cindy, I am going to go to you, but I'd like to move on, but maybe you could.
Just one brief comment. This is the precedent. This bill would be the precedent for a tax on water. There have been past bills. For example, 2011, Senator Simidian, who was here then, had a bill. It had two parts to it, and we called it the blank check bill. It had a section with a tax on urban water, and it had $1 and a blank, and then all the ways that money could be used. Then it had another section, and it was a tax on ag water, $1 and a blank, and then all the ways that fund could be used. And there's many across the state who would like to have a tax to fund all different kinds of things. And that bill didn't pass, and Aqua, opposed that bill. But this bill is narrower, but it would be a precedent in California for a tax on water, and we would oppose that.
Okay, I'm going to move on to a new topic that also was prompted significant conversations this year related to, after the drought, thinking about long-term conservation and efficiency. And there's a bill still pending that would require agencies to establish long-term urban water use efficiency standards with additional components related to agricultural water use. So, Cindy, I am going to start with you. Can you briefly describe how local agencies are thinking about long-term conservation and how that may differ, or what kind of overlaps with what's pending in the legislature?
Sure. In this, this could be like 3 hours, but I'll try to keep it short. And there's a lot of history here that we've gone through in the drought. But, we represent public water agencies. They are special districts, they are cities, and they do a fantastic job in providing a reliable water supply for their customers across the state. They are committed to being prepared for drought. They're committed to doing a good job responding to drought. I think and of course it's their customers who did a lot of the work, but they did a great job through this last drought. And they're committed to having improved water use efficiency long-term in California. So, we agree with the authors of the bills on the intent, but again, in this area, it really gets down to the detail to make this work on the ground. And part of it's the state role and the local role, the tension there. And we think there should be a partnership between the state and the locals. And there's specific issues in the bills. The two bills remaining are SB 606 and AB 1668. We think if there are detailed, in-depth conversations over the interim and next year, these bills can be worked out. I'll just, if it's okay, just highlight like 3 issues which show what some of the issues are. One is data. The bill would have the water suppliers calculating a water use objective annually, but it has the state provide data once. We think there's a need for more ongoing data from the state. We're hoping that issue can be worked out. Another issue is relative to these water use and its water use efficiency objectives. We want to make sure that they're feasible for the calculation, and generally they will be, but there'll be some areas, some local systems that have unique facts where we think an alternative way to calculate these objectives is needed, and we're suggesting that the bill authorize the Department of Water Resources to have an alternative calculation method. This might be an area, for example, where there's an urban part to the area, but also a wild land or ag land, maybe there's a small livestock issue in a community, that kind of thing. So some special facts, those need to be accommodated in this bill. And then third, a major category is what should the enforcement authority be for the state and for the locals in this area. We think it's very important that the state provide the needed technical assistance to help water agencies and their customers meet the objective. And we think it's important that the state have an enforcement role where a system is not stepping up and pursuing that objective, but where the locals are stepping up and doing what they should do, we don't think the state should have a punitive enforcement role. So we think that can be figured out, but we just need people coming together, rolling up their sleeves, and working through those issues. So hopefully there can be an accord reached next year.
And Dave, what about from the agricultural community and their thoughts on long-term demand management?
Well, just a word on the legislation Cindy was talking about AB 1668. We actually had significant concerns early in the process and have worked those through, and we've removed our opposition. And so we think there's a way to get there. For agriculture, the heart of the bill is a requirement that ag water agencies quantify the water use efficiency tools or measures that they would implement as part of a drought management strategy. And so that's kind of common sense, and I think most agencies have already been engaged in that. But a lot of this goes to data. I think Cindy's right. How you quantify the benefits of those water use efficiency measures. What systems do you use that the state will look kindly upon? Those kinds of things, I think, can be kind of troublesome details. In terms of demand management in agriculture, I mean, look, the ag sector, especially in the San Joaquin Valley, has been subjected to, as everybody knows, wild swings in water reliability in the last decade plus, and that has forced changes in cropping patterns. We've all talked about the move to more permanent crops, which hardens demand on the one hand, but also brings a higher profit margin on the sale of the commodity. And when water's price goes up, and when other costs of doing business in the farming sector go up, as they do incredibly in California, farmers understandably have to look for profit margins that allow them to continue to operate in this state. And so we're in a bit of an internal conflict here. We're hardening demand by going more and more to permanent crops, the trees and vines, At the same time, we have increasingly unreliable surface water supplies. And again, this is really mostly true for the San Joaquin Valley. So how do farmers respond to that fact, that reality? In California, I think setting aside water as an individual or a single factor, but looking at all factors that affect long-term business planning for farming in California, the trajectory here is not very good. Our costs of producing are far higher in California than in neighboring states where we can grow a lot of the same crops. My association represents members in 4 states. California is our biggest one by far, but we also have a lot of members in Arizona and Colorado and New Mexico. And while my members won't say this publicly usually, the larger ones who've been consolidating and buying up smaller farmers are setting up more and more operations in those states and other western states, in Florida and Texas, and of course in Mexico and South America. And so I think, it sort of begs a very fundamental question for California, which is if you look out over the horizon far enough, if those trend lines don't change, we won't have the agriculture sector that we have today. It is starting to show some signs of reduced capacity, reduced production for a lot of reasons, as I said. And so I would rather we not just stumble into that reality and lose something that I think is very, very important to the state and to the nation. But coming back to water, that lack of reliability, especially around surface supplies, and now the looming requirements of the Groundwater Management Act, those two things together will force some hard business decisions, I think, for a lot of those larger companies, which is what's happening. As much as we like small farmers and small farms in California, at least we say we do, our policies are forcing consolidation. And so those larger operations that have the wherewithal will diversify their production so that they're not entirely dependent on California.
Okay, I'm getting the signal to go to Q&A, but before I do that, I really want to just go back down the line one more time and give everyone a chance to maybe mention a topic or an issue that we haven't mentioned, since we only really covered our first two big questions on issues at the state level, in our legislature, or at the federal level that you see coming up in the next year or so that we all should keep our eye on related to California water management. And I'm going to start with Laurel, and maybe quick 30 seconds each go down the line before Q&A.
So in addition to what we talked about, I would highlight affordability as a growing concern. It's something that the State Water Board is looking at in AB 401, but it's also something that is part of SB 623, which we didn't talk about a lot, but ensuring each system can afford to supply safe drinking water. It's also part of conservation, which but we didn't talk about this quite as much with that, but making sure that we're really making conservation a way of life so that we can address affordability and reduce the need for new supplies that are really the cost drivers, or one of the main cost drivers, and in addition to the growing needs that we have. So I think affordability and new, especially things like trying to address Prop 218 reform, which again is one of those things where everyone agrees that it should be a priority, but it's never enough of a priority for anyone to get it done. I think that's something that is on the horizon, and also things that we can address in each of these items that we discussed in one way.
Cindy.
I agree with the Laurel. Next year, the affordability will be a big issue. Prop 218 will be a big issue. But I'd like to change gears in my 30 seconds and talk about fire issues and headwaters. This is something we're very concerned about. We're working in Washington on legislation, and if any year there should be able to be a solution, hopefully this, 2018 will be the year. But there will be, we're expecting in the Farm Bill for the forestry title to get into forest management and the fire borrowing issue. Of course, there needs to be money for the fighting of the fires. We have people in the Aqua family who lost their homes in like Santa Rosa, for example. But we have to have the money for forest management. It impacts not only the water supply, but if you've ever seen how after a fire, when the rains come and the ash just runs off into the receiving streams and contaminates the water, which is part of our drinking water supply. It's horrible. So we need to solve these issues. We're working to get federal money for that.
Dave.
And very quickly, I'll also talk federal a little bit. We've all observed how productive Congress is, but there's been, an occasional conversation about an infrastructure package moving forward, and we've been working with Western senators, especially on that, so that if there is an infrastructure package, we'll have a Western water component to that. We actually started that process 2 years ago, and have a pretty strong coalition of Western senators, both sides of the aisle, all of whom, of course, are looking for projects for their states. Gets a little sticky because 2 of my 4 states that we represent have some tugs of war, which Mr. Keitlinger can talk about. But anyway, hopefully if that conversation gets going in Congress, we'll have an opportunity to flow some monies to Western states. California could use a lot of it, obviously, and we could go on and on about the projects, but there are plenty of them.
Great. All right, so we're ready to open it up to all of you. We have some staffers who are walking around the room with microphones, so raise your hands if you have a question, and someone will come to you, and I'll help direct that. I would like to just say that we are looking for questions, not statements, so if you could get to the question part as quickly as you can, then we can cover as much as hopefully a lot in the next 15 minutes. So please raise your hand, and we'll, right back here.
One thing you didn't mention is a piece of federal legislation that affects California water. That's H.R. 23 that passed the House of Representatives and is currently pending in the U.S. Senate. I was wondering, Dave, if you and Cindy, your organizations, are following that bill, and if you have a position on it.
We are following it. We support the bill, knowing full well that it will not emerge out of the Senate in any form that it currently looks like. And whether anything can get through the Senate, I don't know. But I think it's unlikely that it will move through the Senate without dramatic changes.
And I don't have anything to add to what Dave said.
Okay. Do we have one over here?
Cindy, Laurel suggested that relying on general fund money year after year is not a good way to finance local water systems, and you're opposed to what you called a tax. I think you used that word a few times. Is there some way you guys can come together on this so a year from now you'll be singing Kumbaya rather than opposing each other?
Well, we have done that on other issues, and Aqua. I'm looking at Tim Quinn, my boss, who's probably the.
So am I.
Hi, Tim. The ultimate optimist in the universe. But we tried to solve problems, and we worked with some of the groups here on SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014. That was hugely controversial, hugely challenging to work through, and we worked through that. If we can do that, we should be able to solve this problem. We are committed to putting the hours in to do it. And maybe the 3 of us and Gail and others need to go out for some cocktails, but it is a serious problem, and we do want to solve it. So hopefully we can do that.
All right. I'm having a hard time seeing. Okay. Right here, Stephanie.
Jay Ziegler, Nature Conservancy. In full disclosure, we are supporting Senate Bill 623. You have all underscored critical needs in the water system, from upper forest watershed health to affordable drinking water in a more holistic way. I could add to that the need. We have a $40 billion Central Valley Flood Protection Program with no funding stream. And we also have critical needs for habitat and water flows to meet the needs for nature in the system. And I'm just curious what your solution set would be in thinking about those wider systemic needs that I think we all recognize. Thanks.
Who wants to start? Laurel?
Well, I'll just underscore, I think that the way that I mean, if you look at this publication and, consistently our water issues, like each one of them needs to figure out a funding source to be able to address these needs. We all have to figure out how we're going to have sustainable funding sources to address, whether it's infrastructure, ecosystems, all of these pieces. And it can't all be the general fund, or it can't all be, let's hope that Congress on the federal level works and gives us something. But I also think what we're trying to do with 623 is say, let's tailor these things to be specific on the needs and the way that they're structured. I think each one of these needs to look at innovative financing systems. But it is a common challenge. I think it's a challenge across the water industry. I would like to see us be, more constructive and proactive in identifying funding sources that really can be sustained and solve these things.
So one note that I think should be made is when you look at the funding for water projects of all kinds, most of that is from the local level. And locals have stepped up, and of course they have to go through Prop 218 processes, but they do a great job of the planning and investments at the local level. On the another source of funding is the bonds, and Jay, I know the Nature Conservancy was very involved this year in SB5, and of course in a bond that helped influence SB5. If you look at SB5 and you look at the Natural Heritage Institute, both of those measures have funding that we liked, on forest issues and other issues related to ecosystems. So there's some good funding there.
Okay, I'm gonna go to Kelly over here.
Hi, Ken Barronclaw from UC Riverside. Question for Dave. First, thanks for your frank comments about the agriculture community's point of view on our nitrate problem. You mentioned that we do a much better job today. We're more efficient. You also mentioned one study out of UC Davis. There was another one, maybe published in the past year, called the California Nitrogen Assessment, that found that there's still a very large contribution each year from agriculture to the total nitrogen balance in California's environment. Looking forward, what kinds of policy solutions do you think the agricultural community could get behind to address future flows of nitrogen into the environment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really a wonderful opportunity for land-grant universities and agriculture to work together with, this will be a funding solution too, with hopefully federal funding or state funding that provides incentives to farmers to adopt new practices and new technologies to further determine the actual rate of nitrogen leaching below the root zone, and then adopt new practices to get better at it. I think, a lot of this is regional, right? I mean, you have distinctions region to region. If you look at the San Joaquin Valley, where there's an ag order in place that is very strict from the state and regional water boards in terms of nitrogen application and monitoring and reporting, I think you're going to see have already seen and will see continued fast adoption of best practices. Same with Salinas Valley. But I think there are probably other parts of the state where we don't have that sort of rigor in regulatory oversight of nitrogen application. And I'm not sitting here calling for more regulatory action over farmers, but those best practices that we're adopting, we're learning in large measure with help of the universities for those regions, for the Salinas Valley and for the San Joaquin Valley, can be moved over to other production regions. But again, I think there's probably a need for some incentive funding there.
Thank you. Back, Serena, where you are.
Thank you. I enjoyed the talk and the discussion, but have you considered manufacturers that produce the pipes and to transport the water? Since this is a statewide issue, a lot of the materials used in pipes and other vessels have contaminants, and that I didn't hear any talk about that in this presentation. Are you planning on including them?
Great, yes. Yes, SB 623 includes all contaminants, so it's not restricted to just source water contaminants like arsenic. It can be used for lead. It can be used for any of the distribution system contaminants as well. And one thing that we didn't talk about, but to add on to that is, there were a number of bills trying to address lead and school testing in particular this year. And one thing that the state of California has already done is require that all community water systems offer free testing to every school that they serve around lead and copper to make sure that each school is able to know whether they have lead and copper problems. So those are things that schools need to be taking advantage of because they're free and they're important. And then also to note that there is some funding right now. There's also technical assistance for schools to be able to get safe drinking water access points that the State Water Board is administering and is available for schools. And so there's a number of things along those issues. There is a continued problem of, frankly, of not having adequate data that these efforts are trying to address around lead and copper in particular.
Cindy, did you have anything to add?
Yes, the legislature had 6 bills on lead this year. This is a new trend we're seeing. On conservation, there were 9 bills at one point. On lead, there were 6 bills, and we were involved in all of those bills. But on lead, we worked with multiple authors on basically a framework kind of approach, and the governor did sign AB 746, which is going to require the community water systems to do testing in schools for lead. And so that's a major new program that our agencies will be implementing to protect the health of children.
Okay, where was I going next? I was going to Kelly back here.
Oh, thank you. I was hoping that while discussing priorities for California's water funding mechanism, perhaps, needed to be discussed. So I suppose it's not on the agenda today. What I'm talking about, sometimes who should pay for what gets lost in this discussion. As an example, Ms. Tuck mentioned that she's for taxing agriculture, but she's against taxing drinking water. Those who have taken Econ 1 know that regardless of who you tax, businesses or consumers, we all share the burden of the tax. So saying that singling out one group really doesn't matter. We all end up paying for it. General funds, for example, what are the sources of general funds? Individual income taxes, businesses taxes, and so on. So it's all the same, really. So I don't understand why we're opposing one and we are for the other.
Sure. So, and it wasn't Aqua that suggested the fee on fertilizer sales or fee on dairies, but I think Community Water Center, Western Growers, and others worked for many months to develop this part of the bill as a solution. And it's a fee because there's a connection to nitrate. The other part of the bill is a tax because you have local water agencies collecting the money from areas that don't have the problem. They have safe drinking water, and they're not benefiting from that payment. So that is why it's a tax on the drinking water side. And so we're suggesting that this, because it's a social issue for the state, that the state should be a state funding source, and the state should collect it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. No pressure, whoever it ends up being. Kelly's got one.
Yeah, hi, my name is Steven, and thank you guys for speaking today. This is really informative. Excuse me. The question I have actually goes back to Dave specifically about, sorry about that. You had mentioned that some of your representatives in other states, they are actually cheaper in costs in terms of the ability to do business and be a farmer. And so one of the questions I had as we ramp up kind of data transparency and water production and where it's going and how taxes are applied is when the data comes out, when we start metering agricultural and irrigation and farmers, and we start to see the quantified costs or the production usage, do you think the costs are going to increase or decrease when it comes to water? And I guess what's the trajectory future for water costs versus other costs when it comes to farming in California?
Yeah, water costs are going to increase. They already have. They will increase more. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is going to limit the ability of individual farmers to drop new wells and use their existing wells to pull water out of the ground. As I mentioned earlier, you couple that with less reliable surface water flows into those regions, which is the source of the recharge for the basin, and you're talking about scarcity, sort of permanent scarcity. Kern County, for example, water agencies that have formed the Groundwater Sustainability Agency down there are predicting or projecting a loss of somewhere on the order of 500,000 to maybe 900,000 acres of irrigated land out of production permanently when SGMA is in full effect, unless something changes dramatically in the way we manage and allocate surface waters, which we don't see. So yeah, the cost of water will continue to go up. Ellen has spoken about, and PPIC has advocated the need for a more robust water marketing mechanism in California. That has a lot of upside potentially to manage, to help ameliorate that effect of ag land being forced out of production. If you have some areas that are water rich one year, other ag areas that are water poor, if you have a functional water trading or market system and the conveyance capability to move water, that can help preserve the ag sector in the state considerably.
All right, thank you very much. Please join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. And I invite up Jeff in our next panel.